Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cludo's Masters of series, where we have conversations with smart people about topics we care a lot about, specifically content management, especially in complex websites and other complex situations. We talk about user experience. We try and talk about where the web is going and where websites are going, and pay attention to how our customers are interacting with the web. Today, we have a special guest. We're actually looking inside the Cludo walls, and we're going to have András from our engineering team talk to us about all things AI and a bunch of other hot topics that we talk about a lot here at Cludo. András, why don't you introduce yourself real quick, and we'll jump right into it.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is András, and I'm a machine learning engineer at Cludo, or I think it's more appropriate to say that I am the machine learning engineer at this point at Cludo. Yeah, I've been with the company for about a year and a half at this point, and started originally as a data scientist. Now I've sort of rebranded myself as ML engineer. I can talk about that transition a little bit on what these things mean if you think that's interesting, and perhaps we can delve into the AI stuff.
Yeah, well, let's start there. Actually, I mean, you've been with Cludo since early 2023. There's been quite a lot of change when it comes to machine learning and AI since that time. But I'd like to even start before that. It seems like throughout your career, you've been drawn to languages, and I know you speak many languages and are learning new ones all the time. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background, how you got into languages, and how you got into machine learning as a result of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I actually came into data science, machine learning from an interesting sort of angle. I actually took linguistics in college and philology, sort of, history, all those things that literature. But I was super into the linguistics part of it, which is, just the sort of scientific study of language and languages, structures of languages, how they work. And I really got into this. I've also studied a bunch of languages as out of just interest. And so this is basically what got me into something called NLP, which stands for natural language processing, which you can call a subfield or a subdiscipline of AI or machine learning, whatever you want to call it, which has to do with essentially computers dealing with human language. So, I mean, sort of the ultimate NLP application that one might think of nowadays is something like ChatGPT or other large language models, LLMs. But it's a field that's been around for decades. And when you think of things like machine translation or even something like a simple chatbot, the way they used to work before generative AI, that's all sort of a product of NLP. And so having this linguistics background, a lot of people go into academia or translation or teaching. I sort of wanted to do teaching for a while, but then kind of decided that wasn't for me. Academia also wasn't. And then I thought, well, I might as well go into this niche sort of study of NLP, which has turned out to be super interesting.
Yeah, awesome. And you've been at it a while, and you've been with Cludo for a little while too. In your current title, if I'm getting it right, machine learning engineer. What does that actually mean? What's day to day look like? What are some of the projects you're working on? How does that impact customers? Like, I think maybe people that are listening to this would want to know a little bit of what your world is like, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, what you do is very different from company to company. Obviously, we're a pretty small company, and like I said, we basically have a one man AI team at the moment. So part of my work is to explore what's out there and sort of to know and explore what AI machine learning solutions exist and how we can use them to make a better product. We'll talk about some of the things we do later in this episode. But so basically, I try to stay informed and then implement features and products. So I actually sit and write a lot of code. Also, I'm involved in sort of strategic decisions about how certain products that we're rolling out now with AI features should look like, based on sort of what others are doing, what are some industry trends, and what we believe as a company would make good features a good product.
Right. And one of the other angles that I think about is you're kind of the subject matter expert that then informs the rest of the development engineering team from the front end to the back end and informs the rest of the customer facing team as well. So you are one of our inside people with a lot of subject matter expertise. With that in mind, I would assume it can be somewhat challenging to help folks understand some of the concepts that are super important, whether it's
Hmm.
things that we use in our day-to-day, like perplexity we've talked a lot about recently, and there's clearly things in the Cludo product. When it comes to machine learning or AI, even generative AI in particular, are there ways that you've found are better to explain it to folks that maybe don't have as much experience? Is there common misconceptions? As that conduit of knowledge for the company and beyond, what have you learned about how to explain things clearly to people that may not be subject matter
Hmm.
experts themselves?
That's a good question. Well, you mentioned something that made me think about how it's actually not easy to stay on top of all of this information because there's just so much coming out, especially since ChatGPT came out about 2 years ago. It's been like a storm, a flood of AI and LLM related features and products. So it's not easy to stay on top of all of that info, and also to make sure that people really do understand. And I have seen a lot of sort of requests or products even where people just want to put AI in the name of a product, but really, or just want to use AI for something that can be solved in a much easier way, or maybe this is not the right approach. But I would say, like, I mean, I like to say that AI, machine learning, these are kind of the same thing the way I see it. Some people say that one is a subfield of another. The way I like to explain machine learning is that it's so I did have to look up, but I did look up a bunch of definitions for this actually, because I thought it was interesting how people define this. And so one of the definitions that I like personally is machine learning is systems that allow computers to learn and make decisions without explicit programming. And I think AI is kind of the same thing the way I see it. Whereas when you're writing a piece of software where you have a lot of code, and in that code you'll have certain decisions that you make based on the input that requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of work by a human expert or a team of human experts. But machine learning, what it does is basically uses a combination of data and algorithms to basically determine these outputs by learning all of this rather than having to program explicitly. I don't know if that makes sense, but this is how sort of I like to explain machine learning. And then another sort of component is that it's in the end, it's all kind of statistics. When you have a bunch of data, which you make decisions using a variety of algorithms, in the end, it all boils down to math and statistics, how these things work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It makes sense. It's an interesting perspective just in terms of the decision making without direct human intervention all the time. And clearly, there are things that humans need to do to intervene to avoid hallucinations, to make sure that the output is actually in line with either things that are expected or truthful, or in some cases, very like highly engaging. Like we've seen some video examples recently that we've talked about that are clearly not meant to be manifestations of the truth, but are very engaging nonetheless. As you see the space evolving so fast, do people have misunderstandings typically when you talk to them? Do they either have expectations that are out of whack, or even perhaps from our customers, like, are you hearing things that are misaligned that way, or are people generally getting it? Are we moving in the right direction in terms of mutual understanding of where we're at?
Yeah, I am definitely seeing a lot of misunderstandings, or maybe just like expectations that aren't quite realistic. And I think this is where expectation management is obviously super important. This is not to diminish something like ChatGPT or large language models in general. I'm going to keep referring to ChatGPT, I think, because that's kind of like, in a way, what a lot of people are familiar with as an LLM. But like, I think it's important to understand that these things are not magic, and ultimately they make decisions based on some statistics, some data that these models have seen before. So that's one thing that we need to remember. You brought up the topic of hallucinations, which is this term that we use to refer to essentially like false information, or made up pieces of information by these language models that sound very true, sound very accurate, but actually are completely made up. That's what people in the AI field call hallucinations. And so, like, very often I see people using LLMs without really understanding that actually the output could be completely wrong. And again, it's not to diminish the awesomeness of these systems, because they really do work really, really well for a lot of things. So that's one thing. And then maybe another thing that I've seen is I think I kind of touched on this before, how especially with the appearance of LLMs, I've seen a lot of people on maybe on the product side trying to just use LLMs for everything, and also problems that have been solvable for up to sometimes even decades
Mm.
with other much more leaner, much more easily accessible, and much cheaper methods.
Mm.
But just a lot of people who are not in the field might not have been aware that these things existed. So, throwing a large language model at an issue, at a problem that could be solved 20 years ago with something very simple, rule based, or a simple statistical model, I do see people doing that sort of stuff.
Super interesting. Why do you think that is? Like, why are people glomming onto LLMs as the solve all the problems using this? Is it a hype cycle thing, or what are you thinking, or what do you see there?
I think it's partially because, like I said, unless you've been in the field, like, you just maybe don't know that there are other tools out there. And I'm going to give you an example here. So there's something in NLP that is called named entity recognition, NER, which basically has to do with like extracting named entities from text, which could be people's names or names of countries, organizations, names of currencies, whatever you want to do, right? So like this could be useful when you want to analyze like a contract or something like that, or just want to like identify what kind of actors there are that are being talked about in a given text, how they relate to each other. You can connect that to all sorts of databases. So this is something that has been, researched for decades now, and there are many, many thousands of applications out there. A lot of companies use some form of NER, and we've had machine learning models that have existed to fulfill this particular purpose, to find the named entities in text. Now, large language models like ChatGPT can also do this very well, but we don't need to use them for it. I mean, these other older, sometimes simpler and cheaper and leaner models already exist, but you might not know about it unless you've been working with NLP for the last however many years. So that's one side of it. And then the other side, I think, is LLMs are great for creating proofs of concept. So it's like, especially with how, for example, you have the API from OpenAI to access ChatGPT. All you need to do is, write 3 lines of code, maybe not even that, because you can go on their playground and then try your whatever you want to do with your data there. You just write a very basic prompt, which is the set of instructions you're giving the LLM, and you have a POC, which is quick and dirty, works really, really well. I mean, you're covering, maybe 95% of what you need in terms of accuracy. And then if you think that you want to make this into a product, if you want to make it better, if you want to get that remaining 5%, or we're not going to get to 100%, but the long tail of whatever problem you're trying to solve, then you might want to switch to maybe your own model, maybe a specialized model. And so LLMs are actually good for these sort of things, and also as generative models. But like I said, they're not just a tool that will solve everything, and there are other tools that exist out there.
Yeah, and of course there's trade-offs too, with in terms of either performance or energy usage or other external kind of things that people are thinking about. I think one of the other things that we've reflected on as a company, and you and I have talked about a bit too, is tools like Figma coming out with AI tools that are aligned with part of the market, but maybe some of their other users want other features that are not AI related. You've got tools like Gong that are super powerful and have added layers of what they're calling AI summaries on top of what they're already doing. So I think there's like a layer of AI in some cases that makes a lot of sense. In some cases, users and customers actually want something else. They have other needs that they want to fill first before taking things to this next level of kind of generative AI, or applying some of these models in different ways that don't solve problems as directly as what they actually have in mind. So it's something from Cludo's perspective, like we are making decisions along those lines all the time. I think since obviously you work in Cludo and you work with our customers on a daily basis and with our engineering team on a daily basis, clearly that's where a lot of your context and a lot of your thinking probably reflects on. Neither of us want to make this a commercial for Cludo, but thinking about Cludo as a way for our customers to connect their websites and other properties with huge data sets to an actual human looking for something specific or wanting to discover some specific type of content, taking that big lump of content, putting it in the hands of a website visitor on their screen in a way that makes sense. It's a big challenge for a lot of our customers, and that's where we try and help. What are you seeing from that perspective, and obviously being informed with that every day? What are the big challenges that you're seeing for people that are trying to solve specific problems, maybe specifically with their websites? Challenges in terms of language, their data sets, other ways that they're grappling with trying to make the use of these tools and how AI plays into that. Any observations in terms of what are some prevailing challenges that people are trying to solve for?
I mean, the ultimate sort of basic challenge with information retrieval or search is getting the right data and being able to find what you're looking for. Essentially, I think that's been mostly cracked, this problem. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but mostly really good. Like within the field of NLP, I'd say that information retrieval sort of has been one of the most well researched and oldest sort of problems. And so there's a lot of algorithms there that make this happen. And that is something that where AI does come in. So for us, for example, search is kind of our core product. And we're also currently looking into many different ways how to optimize our retrieval. So how to get the data, how we can use AI for that. So for instance, one way to implement machine learning and AI there is using something called vector search, or building on top of vector search, hybrid search, which is based on these AI generated embedding vectors, which are representations of text in a numerical form. And this is sort of has been an evolution of how search has been done. So even though search has been around for a very, very long time, and this challenge has been there, the community is constantly finding more and more ways to approach it. And vector search is definitely one of those. Another thing that is super interesting is the ranking. I mean, when you go on a search results page, then you're going to see the results presented in some sort of order, and the machine learning also comes in there. So like there's different ranking algorithms. You can learn to rank, so to say, based on some output that you'd like to achieve. So there's a lot of different places where AI and machine learning come in. And that, I think, to me shows that there is still a lot of challenges that need to be solved, because people are looking for that relevance. People are looking for easier and better ways to find their data.
I think the piece of what you're describing is just understanding the behaviors. And I actually look at that from a couple different angles. One, not every search is the same, right? So if I'm on a manufacturer's website and I need to have a specific part number that's like an 8-digit character that's very, very specific, if I search for that, I have a very clear pathway to what I'm trying to find. I might be trying to order that exact part another time, or see the user manual for a specific manufactured good. Or if I'm on a higher education site, I may have a specific course number that I'm looking for and I need details on. So those are very specific. And then there's things that are more exploratory, in things that maybe more are framed in human language without super specifics. In a set of different terms could all result in the same intent of what someone's actually looking for. So as we dig into the problem more and more, and as we understand user behaviors more and more, there's just a lot more to think about and to think through. And then you introduce things like generative AI in the search results pages for tools like Perplexity and Google, and others are now having answers that are generative and can be dug into and prompt based and have source materials included and all that good stuff. I think part of that is a fascinating space. Applying the technology behind the scenes is part of what you're describing. One thing that comes to mind along those lines is AI is not just a part of a tool like Cludo or a solution like Cludo. It's also part of our day-to-day. It's part of probably your actual Cludo workflow. You're probably using other AI tools to do your work, or other AI voices to stay informed. Any advice for people in terms of either the day-to-day work, what tools you're using to do your work, or what you're reading, listening to, watching to stay informed?
Yeah, sure. For programming, I use something called GitHub Copilot, which is essentially something that helps you complete code. So it's kind of like autocomplete on steroids for code. It's really great in predicting, like if you're writing a function or a method, then it often completes it for you. So it saves you a lot of time. Or just if you're writing repetitive chunks of code, it can also fill in the parts that might be variables there really, really well. Obviously, with these things, you need to know what you're doing. I don't recommend using something like Copilot if you have no idea like about coding, or if it's a programming language that's completely foreign to you. I code mainly in Python, which is, I think it's not controversial to say that it's the primary language of machine learning and AI today. But I do always like double check that, okay, either this is exactly what I wanted to write, but it just recommended and I just didn't have to now, or it's very close and I understand what it's doing. But the moment you don't understand what it's recommending to you, that's where you need to start digging deeper. And so that's one thing. I also use ChatGPT as sort of like a programming buddy or companion to sort of explain code. I think it's really good at that, especially when I work across teams looking at other programming languages that we have in our repositories, but I'm not personally familiar with. There might be things that I don't immediately understand just looking at the code. So for that, asking ChatGPT, oh, can you tell me what this does? How would you do this in Python? And then it explains what it does, and then it tells me in Python so I can see what it looks like in a language that I'm familiar with. So that is super useful, for example. But like I'm aware that a lot of people do this. And I think also like in our marketing team, we have people doing generative AI and using image and voice generation. I think some video stuff has been looked into as well. So there's a lot of things going on that side of the house too.
Yeah, of course. This is a couple days after the Toys R Us first ad produced by Sora kind of came out, and there's all sorts of conversation around that. It would be interesting to use this as a timestamp and think about how many more brands, how many more marketers are moving in that direction in terms of presenting their brand in a way that's either created by generative AI or other forms of media. It'd be really interesting to see that going forward. So this is the Toys R Us timestamp, and certainly some controversy there. What about like how do you stay informed? We've talked about a few of those tools and a few of the platforms already, but what about information and media that you're consuming to stay informed?
Yeah, so I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts, so that's one thing. There are some AI podcasts that I could maybe recommend. There's one called TWIML AI that stands for This Week in Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence, I believe. It's one of the old sort of classic AI podcasts. Really, really nice. They cover not just NLP, but just anything to do with machine learning, basically. And there's one called Machine Learning Street Talk, where I think they do more sort of deeper dives and interviews with professors and PhDs, where they do also, talk a lot of philosophy around AI and those sort of things. So not necessarily just the technical considerations. And then the Lex Friedman podcast, which I've been listening to since the beginning when it used to be called the Artificial Intelligence Podcast. So especially I recommend going back to like the older episodes. There's a lot of interesting AI and machine learning stuff in the sort of the backlog there. And then newsletters I recommend definitely for staying on top of things, but they are also getting very, very massive right now. I have one that I follow called Last Week in AI, and then there's This Week in NLP, which is more sort of specialized in language technology. It can be a long read, but it's definitely worth it. And then I guess maybe on YouTube, if you're more into videos, I can recommend, well, Marcus Brownlee does a lot of good videos, like just sort of technology in general, but also high level sort of AI education, what it's all about. And then there's a guy called Yannick Kilcher who does a lot of deep dives into papers and all sorts of machine learning stuff there. That's really for those that really want to understand how these things work.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Some names that people probably know and some new ones too. It's interesting, like the whole this week, last week. It does seem like the weekly kind of cadence of information flow sometimes is enough. Sometimes stuff is coming at us even faster than that. We did have one topic that I wanted to touch on because it comes up it's come up in our conversations, and I think it's becoming one of those things that used to be fairly technical and now is more understood commonly. But I'd love for you to give your intro slash second level description of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, something that we have talked about and something we use here at Cludo. And it's like, to me, there is nuance there that's important for people to understand. When we're talking about large content sets that are specific, like our customers' websites in our case, and there's other cases where it can be helpful, RAG as a part of the approach, part of the solution, how does that fit in? How can we help people understand what that actually means a little bit better? Like, how would you describe that to somebody that's just continuing to learn?
Okay, where do I start with this? So RAG, like you said, indeed stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. Here, the generation part stands for generative AI, basically. And then the retrieval augmented part stands for basically using some sort of search algorithm in the background to make that generation better. So we have the search core to this, and we've been developing some products or features that'll be doing or are already doing the generation part. This is not supposed to be too much talking about ourselves necessarily, but we are doing, and you also did mention in terms of Perplexity and Google, for example, how they have the summary features, and we also working on an AI summary feature now, which basically what it does is you're looking at a SERP and you want to get a quick summary of all the data, or at least the top of the result set. So what that does is takes the top of the result set, feeds it to a large language model, and asks that large language model to produce a summary. This is achieved by using this framework called Retrieval Augmented Generation. Maybe some things have to be defined so that we're all on board with what like language model, for example, means. So essentially, we're all familiar with ChatGPT. A lot of the audience probably must have heard that ChatGPT is known as a large language model. So you can think of a language model as a machine learning program or piece of software that predicts language in a way that a human would write it. So these models were trained essentially to produce human-like language given a certain prompt. And the prompt is the set of instructions that you give this model. So when you start chatting with ChatGPT, you start by saying hello. It's going to say hello back and ask you how you're doing. And then you can start having an interaction which feels very natural. But that's because this model was trained on a lot of previous human interactions. So it essentially knows what kind of responses it should be giving. The problem with LLMs in general is that I think we've touched upon this before, how they tend to make things up. This is the hallucination problem that we've talked about. So you can go and ask ChatGPT about something totally random. You can ask it about yourself, for example, and it might make up some facts about this person that might not even exist. Because ultimately, these models weren't really trained to give truthful responses. Like this is something that the AI community is working on, but just to mimic human language. And that doesn't necessarily have to be true and factually correct. So this is the biggest issue. This is what's preventing a lot of these language models being put into production, especially in settings where either security is a concern or truthfulness is very important. So like you can think about medical settings. You don't want to get incorrect medical advice, for example. And so to tackle this, we have something called Retrieval Augmented Generation, where instead of relying on the data that the large language model has internalized, you're feeding it external data and asking it to reply using that data. So when we talk about a search solution like ours, for instance, let's say we have a customer that is a government agency or a municipality, and we want to know a specific opening time of a specific government office in this municipality. Well, you can obviously search for that, but you can also try to ask our AI chat feature and ask for the opening time in natural language. You can literally say, what are the opening times of this and this government office? And if we didn't have retrieval augmented generation in there, what would happen is probably either ChatGPT or any other LLM that doesn't know this, because they have seen a lot of data, but they haven't seen everything, right? I mean, it's possible that this wasn't in their training data, or it's just new information that was added since. So they might either just refuse to answer, they say, I can't tell you, I don't know, or just give you something that's factually incorrect. I hope that everyone's still with me. But with retrieval augmented generation, what you do is you also search in the data set on the website of the municipality, you search for what you're looking for. So essentially you run a search query and you say, okay, opening times of government office at this and this address. That is going to retrieve a bunch of documents from the website. And then we take those and tell the language model, all right, so here is the question that you got. Here are some documents where we think the answer might be found. Please answer the question based on this document, or these documents rather. And this has been shown to be a really good way, a really powerful way to mitigate hallucinations, because the model gets access to the information that it needs to answer the question rather than trying to make something up. So essentially, we're enabling sort of a more truthful response by giving the model some hard facts in a way based on which it can answer.
Makes sense. Makes sense. That's a good example to illustrate the point. I think there's a danger in presenting the hours of an office being open. It might look like, oh, it's open at 9 o'clock, but it's really open at 10 o'clock, and it would seem very believable. So that there's that blurring of those lines that's really important to get right. And it sounds like RAG is a way that is applied to help mitigate those hallucinations, as you said. I know we have covered a lot of ground. I want to leave a little bit of space for some fun stuff. This might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but AI, machine learning, outside of Cludo's walls, whatever comes to mind, whatever's on your mind, predictions. What comes next? Where are we going? It is July 2024 as we're recording this now. I can guarantee you that the future will not look like the present, but what do you think? What are you seeing? What do you predict?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, right? Because I don't think a lot of people could have predicted even something like ChatGPT and how sort of LLMs have proliferated since, and the things we can do with them. I mean, chatbots now like have a completely different meaning than they did even 2 years ago, when basically none of them worked, and you came away frustrated after having been forced into an interaction with a chatbot. You usually didn't like it. Now it's different. We go to something like ChatGPT, which is kind of like a chatbot, and actively want to interact with it. So it's difficult to make predictions, but definitely, I mean, I focus a lot, obviously, on what I do day to day, which is the search domain. For me, I'm seeing super rapid progress to the point where it's indeed difficult to keep track of. On the search side, I'm seeing vector search and hybrid search that are also AI driven. These are becoming more and more ubiquitous and more accessible as well. And I also see a lot of interest in large language models and RAG-based applications. I also have seen how people are more and more informed. So I definitely like how people are now sort of getting more familiar with some technical terms that maybe 2 years ago nobody would have known unless you're working with NLP. So that's nice to see. I expect more of the public to become more and more familiar with AI and how it all works. But sort of going back to the technology, I don't think, like a lot of people say that LLMs are going to replace search. I don't really see it that way. I think search has multiple functions. Like, you sometimes all you want to do is look up somebody's age, or you want to go on Google and there's a football game going on, and you want to see the scores, then Google has a little widget for that. Or you just want to know the weather, then most large search providers support that. You just type in weather in Copenhagen or Minnesota, wherever you happen to be, and it's going to give you a pretty good overview. These things are not going to be replaced by large language models, but maybe some things that have to do with you looking for deeper and deeper information, trying to understand and sort of summarize information that comes from a variety of sources, and getting sort of an overview of that without having to go through potentially a dozen websites. LLMs really are good for that. So we're going in the direction of LLMs becoming much more and more integrated into search, but not necessarily replacing them. So I don't know if this answers your question. it's still kind of within this sort of whole search space, but that's what I've been thinking of the most.
It makes sense. And I think part of what you're describing too, is there is an embracing of things like algorithms. Like people know if they go on Instagram, if they go on TikTok, they know they're being served content that's based on their behavior, based on their profile, but is still very engaging. Generally, there are some people that have rejected, but most of the time, if it makes our experience better, we've accepted the fact and we've embraced the fact that these tools can have predictions that are really relevant to us. They don't hit every time, but they actually do provide a lot of value just for the sake of aligning with our intent, with what our preferences are. So I think this perhaps accelerates that embracing of that. And it's very easy and very, salacious to talk about the fears of AI taking over and generative AI being this kind of potentially out of control evil force that we need to be careful of. I think there's a ton of truth in that. Of course, we need to understand, we need to like have the right controls in place, but there's also, I think history has shown us that there's equally or maybe more so embracing of things that we give away a bit of control to provide a better experience or to provide an easier pathway to achieving whatever goal we're trying to achieve. So super interesting. We're about 7,000 kilometers apart right now, 6,800 kilometers apart, having a live conversation with video, and we can somewhat look each other in the eye and have a good conversation. So it's a representation of how far we've come with technology. And I think it's fun to think about where technology goes next and how we align with our customers and what they're trying to achieve. So thank you for taking some time out of your very busy schedule to talk to us here on Masters of. We will take you up on vetting future guests. If there are people out there in the world that have ideas on who we should talk to or want to be a guest, please let us know. And you can reach us via LinkedIn as shown. We're on YouTube. We're on Spotify. We're everywhere that you want to find your podcast. So thanks for tuning in, and see you next time on Masters of.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks.